Chapter 15, 13th day of October 1679. Stand tall, Captain, and desist your incessant prattle. You must act the part when you come before royalty. I snapped, perhaps a little too harshly, as was evident from his woeful expression. The moment I spoke, I remembered he was no stranger to royalty, that he had once told me how he had travelled far on the continent as a soldier in his younger days, to Spain, Portugal, Flanders, and Holland, and that he had also spent a fair time in the company of William, Prince of Orange. That did not mean I found it any easier to be with him, but it was a necessity I must bear to win this war against us. Willoughby was our only weapon, and I must make use of it as best as I could. It is hardly my fault if I am blessed with a silver tongue, and I am of a happy disposition to use it, he smartly addressed only part of my scold and ignored the rest. We are all lambs, equal in the eyes of the Lord. I am fine as any man, and the king will find no fault in me. He looked as if he might say more, and I was glad he did not. Willoughby oft quoted the Bible of late, the insincerity of his hypocrisy catching in my stomach since I had discovered his part in the death of the priest. Seeing my expression, he closed his mouth, for which I was entirely grateful. I wished to collect my thoughts before being granted admittance to the royal court. He did not allow me the privacy of them for long. Madam, are you aware of the arrests of Mr. Pepys and Sir Dean? It seemed he would still wish to convene with me. Shh! I hushed him. Yes, I have known this a while. I took satisfaction he was put out by this and shut his mouth. I returned to my thoughts of how we had come to this honour extended to us now. It had not been such an easy path through the buzzing swarm guarding the king, a more useless collection of drones I had yet to see, but we were in the heart of the hive now, brought into the brood chamber through connections of devotion of one to another, to ultimately be received by the king rather than the queen. If the Duke and Duchess of York were not abroad, I might have approached her ladyship on the matter, for we had an understanding between us, and she considered herself indebted to me for the taking in of the witnesses. It had been to my benefactor, Lady Paris, to whom I had first presented the dilemma of how to secure an audience with His Majesty. We knew of no straight way to reach our target. If we simply arrived at the gates of St. James's Palace, we would fast be cast off. Someone he trusts must introduce us to him. Lady Paris had been perfectly equal to the puzzle and immediately suggested an exquisite solution. With great fortune, the King of late recovered from a dreadful illness, which every loyal subject had concerns over. It happened, while the king was laid to bed, I chanced upon the astrologer John Gadbury, whom I was impelled to ask how serious was the king's illness, then further asked him if he would discover from the sign of his birth whether or not Captain Willoughby might be trusted with the tasks I wished to set him. Pierre had tasked me to do so long while ago. I know not why I did not do it then, but now it was imperative I should not make a mistake in this. Whilst Gadbury and I walked through the grounds of Westminster Abbey back towards his rooms, he not only released me from doubt over the employment of Willoughby, but further told me that the Duke of York was called home from Brussels to sit by his brother's bed in the event the king might take a turn for the worse. This was good news indeed for our cause, for Lady Paris had connections to the Duke, which she quickly undertook to make good use of. Lady Paris was undertaking to arrange a marital alliance between her nephew and the daughter of her close acquaintance, Lord Peterborough. She designed to appeal to him to agree a meeting with me, that I could introduce him to the captain, with the further hope that Lord Peterborough would then in turn introduce us to the Duke of York. The beauty of this meeting was that not only had Lord Peterborough served beneath the Duke in the war with the Netherlands, but he had also set up and defeated objections to the marriage between the Duke and his chosen wife, Mary of Modena. The Duke was accordingly indebted to him, and was, as hoped, prepared to make allowances for our using him to reach his brother. The plan came to pass as we imagined, and was declared an outstanding success by all of us. Lady Powys first introduced me to Lord Peterborough at his leisure. This she did with such a plume and passion, verily singing my praises, so that the upstanding gentleman, a few years our senior, was quite taken by us. Captain Willoughby behaved the eloquent gentleman, and won over the lord, so that he told his servants to admit his new acquaintance whenever he came to visit. It was as well he had not seen him 6 months earlier with a shaved head and prison lethargy. Truly, I had not expected the captain to shine as he had, and for it to have passed so easily. Soon afterwards, Lord Peterborough sent us notice that the Duke of York wished for him to present us at his residence, and so we went happily confident of our position. Indeed, we were not disappointed. "Come forth and show yourself," said the Duke. His thin face was haggard, as well it might be with the burden of his brother's sickness. Yet his clothes were smart and his appearance sharp. The curved lips of his wide mouth curled lopsidedly as he said, "Lord Peterborough tells me the captain is a young man who appears under a decent figure, a serious behaviour, and with common understanding. I trust his judgment faithfully in this matter. Madame Cellier," he turned to me, "you have denied me the pleasure of your company for many years since you tended my wife, God rest her soul." I had not expected or thought that the king's brother would have noticed my services to the first Duke of York, Anne, daughter of Earl of Clarendon. She was mother of the Princess of York, Lady Mary and Lady Anne, living in Richmond Palace, and the youngest two, Edgar and Catherine, the poor souls that had joined her in death soon after. She had been a Roman Catholic by conviction even before she took her sacraments and made her communion with Rome at her deathbed, and many believed her the cause of the Duke's own conversion. "Your kindness in remembering me, sir, is considerable," I said, curtsying, as Willoughby took his hat off, bowed, and returned it to his head. The Duke studied Willoughby's book, wherein he had recorded every meeting he had considered of a dubious nature, scribbled lists of whom they concerned, and detailed conversations he had recorded those persons as having had with each other. I had myself read of the book and was satisfied that the contents were ruinous to the Presbyterians, who plotted against the king with the purpose of blaming the Duke of York. I observed the king's brother slowly turn each leaf, bent over the sewn pages so that his long brown periwig fell as a curtain to hide his mouth, but I could still see his large protuberant eyes follow his finger over the parchment, marking his progress, and every now and then he exclaimed such as, "Odds life!" or "Saints preserve us, it is as I thought," or "Fie on it, this will not go unpunished," as if no ladies were present. The Duke showed himself keen to ride any road that would alleviate the persecution and suffering of Roman Catholics in London and throughout the three kingdoms. He asked pertinent questions about Stroud and Bedloe, and of Lord Shaftesbury, Reverend Oakes, and others of the Green Club, where many of these exchanges occurred, and listened carefully to the answers, asking further questions where he was unclear. He, being pleasingly perceptive and witty, found Captain Willoughby and myself equally so, and so we left the best of terms, and his vow he would speak to his brother the king on the matter. Though he expressed a doubt whether there was enough to convict any single man of treason, he paid Willoughby the large sum of £20, so that he might continue to discover intrigues and plots in any place where they might be hiding. He then expressed to me the desire to meet again, and proclaimed that, despite circumstances, he had not spent such an enjoyable time in a long while. When we were almost to the door, he called out to me, "Madame Cellier." I turned to him and he added, "I note the late Duchess of York was indebted to you for the sum of £500 or £600. I simply nodded, not wanting to impose obligation on him for his previous wife's unpaid debt, the loss of her having brought such sadness to him. "You did not apply to me for your fee, but you will have it." Then, with less confidence, "Perhaps you might make arrangements to call upon my wife, the Duchess? She has not had great success with child, and your reputation for sound advice is famous. That was common knowledge. Gladly will I do so, sir. I would be most honoured. He nodded his satisfaction, and I curtsied once more before following Captain Willoughby out the door. The Duke of York had been good to his word on both counts. I had received payment for my attendance on his first wife, and he had spoken with King Charles on the subject of Willoughby's discoveries, and we were soon to be admitted to the royal presence. Though I had seen the king before, I had never spoken with him. He was said to be a discerning and tolerant man, if somewhat leaning towards more self-indulgence and extravagance than his brother. It was publicly acknowledged that he openly welcomed the bastards of his many mistresses into the court, including the Duke of Monmouth, though they would never be legitimised as his progeny by his government. Most considered his rule as nearly frivolous, but preferred the way of that to either the austerity and tyranny of Cromwell or the shambles of anarchy in the years after his death. I could not help but smooth my dress beneath my cloak, and then straighten my cloak and hat while I waited, noting that I was no better than Willoughby with his prattling. In fact, if anything, Willoughby was more at ease than I. If he had any apprehension about the imminent meeting, he appeared calm and self-assured, far distant in points from the broken man I had found dirty and tearful and curled as an unborn child in Newgate many months ago. If such a one could look calm, then so could I. I took some time to work at an appearance of composure and confidence, and raised my head in readiness. St. James's Palace was everything a palace should be. The sumptuous rooms were so enormous, and the ceilings so high, I might have been walking outside under some foreign sky with candelabras as scars and portraits of severe ancestors instead of trees. The corridor to the throne room was as long and wide as a metropolis street, yet cleaner and sweeter than the cleanest street on a dry spring day, having been cleansed by the winter rain. If I imagined heaven, it might be something like this. No mud, no muck, and some sort of exotic scent to take away the inevitable smell of dung and smoke that comes with London living. Something about the freshness of the walls and floors made me think of Great Missenden in Buckinghamshire. It was a long while since I had visited the village where I was born. I considered we had been forgotten when a footman called us to the door and bid us enter. "Only be sure to keep your hands out of sight," I whispered to Willoughby. The sight of the tattoos and scars might prejudice the case against us. For some unfathomable reason, I imagined King Charles would enter after we had stood a while. But the moment we entered the room, which was anything but a throne room, and saw we were even now in the presence of His Majesty, both Willoughby and I fell to one knee and bowed our heads. "Take down your hood, m'lady," I was instructed by the footman before he closed the door behind us. I had been uncertain of the protocol. If I exposed my head, might it appear presumptuous? But if I remained hooded, would it seem as if I hid myself? I quickly uncovered myself as instructed. "The Duke of York has said you have some information to impart," said King Charles in a most disinterested voice. "Come closer that I may hear you." Before we entered, the footman said we should not rise before the king gave permission. Now I did not know if I should shuffle along the floor on my knee into his hearing, or whether I should stand and move with dignity. But perhaps bring the king's ire upon us. Willoughby must have had the same thought, for he had stayed where he was also. The king laughed. "Come now, I do not wish to have you shout at me, and I cannot hear you from where you kneel. Have to your feet and come hither." Not one in the kingdom would deny the king's reputation of mischievous humour, and I suspected we had been the source of a secret drollery. To my side I saw Willoughby gracefully raised to his knee, push back to his feet and stand tall in one beautiful movement. My eyes still to the floor, I followed suit with less elegance, a more ungainly rise, and scuffled clumsily forward the few steps to stand beside Willoughby. "Speak now," commanded the king, seeming to become serious. "What is this information you have for me? I am to understand you come to warn me of some plot fouler than all plots before? Then you must tell a good tale, for you have a great rivalry in this. Every other person to enter this chamber comes with the same story," he said with amusement in his voice. "And note this well, I wish to discover plots, but not to create them." I do not know what I had imagined, but I did not suppose the king to have good humour with so many trying to take his life. He was the king, and being king was a serious duty, one that must demand a solemn demeanour in all those surrounding him, and I had thought we must also be serious in his presence. "May it please your majesty," I said, "we are both very relieved you are recovered from your recent sickness, and we are sincerely grateful for your indulgence in granting us audience. I am your humble servant, and, as such, my family lives to serve your majesty. In the manner my father and brother died in service to your father, the king now deceased, I lay my life before you." "Your father and brother were known to me in those troubled times," the king said, "and if for no other reason, for that alone I would see you and offer my thanks to you for their service, and for their lives freely given in defence of my father. I owe you a debt of gratitude. I hope it is my honour and capability to repay." The king's deep voice was as a cello, reverberating deep in me, drawing on memories of my early life. This was the son of the monarch my father and brother died for. A bond such as theirs should be remembered, and for that I would equally honour both my father and his. "As the lives of my father and brother were freely given to your service, so is my life," I reiterated, bowing my head still lower. When the king again spoke, I dared to peek at him through my lashes. "My brother has told me you tended his wife Anne, the late Duchess of York. I understand a debt is still due you. We must look to remedy that sad oversight." "Thank you, your majesty, but the duke has recently settled it." I bobbed my knees to a half curtsy, grateful my former attendance was again acknowledged. "But I am remiss. Who stands this beside you? And what have you to say for yourself?" I imagined the king looked upon the Willoughby, so I went to introduce him. "Your majesty, this man is the good Captain Thomas Willoughby. The game that once was played against Charles the Great, your father, is now played over with his son. Though you jest about it, he has indeed discovered a plot most foul, and is come to reveal it to you." "Begad, a plot!" The king's voice was again underlined with humour, and he appeared to be laughing at me. His next words confirmed he was not ready to take us seriously. "We have plots and plots. Plots in the taverns, plots in the coffee houses, plots on the street corners, and now you come to tell me of yet another design on my life. I am verily the most murdered king in England." Other men in the courtroom laughed at the king's jest. I did not know if to laugh or not. The king made light, and might expect it of me, but this was no matter for humour. If he did not take it seriously, it might cost him his life, and if I did not take it seriously, it might cost me mine. "Your majesty, I humbly beg you take none of this one. Your majesty, I humbly beg you take note of this one, for I have heard of it with my own ears and know it to be true." Willoughby spoke beside me. I sensed he spoke to the floor. "Your majesty, I humbly ask your permission to speak." "By all means, Willoughby, but first listen to me carefully. If you inform me well, I will reward your service accordingly. but if you steer me along a false path, you will find one of my prisons a familiar home. Be sure to choose your words well, my man. In this room I have listened to many false tales from those who hope to open my purse." The laugh had gone from the king's voice, and I sensed he knew too well how readily a man or woman would perjure him or herself for the sake of gold in the hand. Then he spoke to me. "Mrs. Cellier, do you vouch for this man?" Though I knew I must not, I paused momentarily. I freely vouched for him to Lady Paris and Lord Peterborough and to the Duke of York. But now the king asked me if I could trust him, and I could not be as certain as I had been. He had shown himself sometimes unreliable. Could the king trust his life to this man? If the captain's tale be false or misled, I would be held accountable for him. But then, contrary to this, his original nature, Willoughby had shown himself to be a good navigator ere now, and had since repented of all his previous sins. He might steer us well, and perhaps save the king's life. "This man has come in the way of a hard life, sir. Look me in the eye when you talk, madam. I wish to weigh your sincerity." I obeyed the king and looked into the eye of the great man. His upturned lips brought up the corner of his moustache in a delightful manner, and his striking smile caused his fine-trimmed three-point beard in the style of Van Dyck, made famous by the royal painter, to stand out towards me. And upon my soul, his periwig was a cascade of immaculate dark brown curls, brushed and oiled to perfection, so it gleamed when he leant his head. Yet though gaiety marked his face below the nose, his eyes examined me with the seriousness of a man that guards against ever-present danger to his life. All this I took note of, while his regal stance and composure, though I had prepared myself for his company, reminded me to pull my back straight and tall, so that I may measure up to even a small part of him. Even more than his presence was the look upon his face. He might jest about the plots, but he was more ready to listen than I had thought. "The captain has late come from the service of the Prince of Orange and the Duke de Villahermosa," I said, to cover that Willoughby had been up to all manner of no good abroad. It was true, the captain had been in the army in Spain and other places, and though he had been back for some time, that was a piece of the tale that would not lend itself to the king's belief in the story. Since his return he has fallen in with some people of the most obnoxious kind. "And this lends himself to me?" he asked, echoing my own concerns on this manner. "He has fallen in with them of his own free will, sir, for to discover their deeds and designs, for he was shocked indeed when he heard them speak." "What designs and deeds are these?" The king looked directly at Willoughby, who still looked to the ground, so did not see. I elbowed him in the side, and he recoiled as though I had poked him with a stick on a sore spot, a noise such as the one he might be better found in a pig-house, though he fast collected himself. "Designs so dastardly, deeds so dire, your majesty, and I heard them spoken with my own ears." "Well, man, what are these schemes you speak of?" For the first time Willoughby raised his head and looked the king straight in the eye, a brave and even hardy move, yet a bold one that gave him credence. "It was not my intention, your majesty, to dig myself into the den of the foxes. I put on the crafty fox coat, that I might run with the cunning creatures and discover their conspiracy, for I heard them talk of it." "Tell me, what did they talk of, and which fox was it that did the talking?" Willoughby looked carefully and suspiciously at each man surrounding the king. "Can we speak alone?" "Speak openly, man. I trust each of these men with my life. Anything you have to say to me may be said in front of any of them." Willoughby nodded. "If that is so, I am happy that you are protected so well. This is what I must tell you." He paused but a moment, I thought, for effect. "The topic whispered round the coffee table is of how to weigh the appearance of a plot against your Majesty into the balance of the Catholics, while furthering the cause of the Presbyterians. Members of the Green Ribbon Club sit confidently side by side, respectable men spinning their imaginings into plots most wicked. The king's eyebrows raised momentarily. Get to the point, man. The point is a salient one, your Majesty, and sharp as duelling swords that cut through leather and skin from 2 steps away. The point is likely to cost your Majesty's life if it is not heeded well. Again he paused for effect, and I was both impressed and repulsed by his manipulative nature. An army collects in the Netherlands and stands ready for the call to arms. This army awaits but a word from England, an invitation from some that stand beside you and behind you at the throne, so close you might easily think them trusted brethren, so credible that their word and the word of their stooges has caused the death of many innocents ere this time. Now dramatically, Willoughby looked at each of the men in the room as if he might identify the traitors merely by their appearance. Would that it was so easy. Name these vermin, for I will chase them to earth and dig them out with my hounds. Lord Shaftesbury leads the pack, for he has propositioned William of Orange. My brother's son-in-law? Interrupted Charles. Yes, sir. William of the Netherlands wed to Mary Stuart, daughter of the Duke of York. I know my own nephew. Continue. Even King Charles grew weary of Willoughby's speeches, it seemed. I fear their plan was to throw the government of the 3 kingdoms into upheaval by the murder of Sir Edmundbury Godfrey, and the casting of blame of that poor man's death onto Catholic hands. I have heard men talk in the taverns and coffee-houses, and I have listened well. Tell me more of what you have heard, prompted the king, when Willoughby's voice trailed away. I hoped his devotion to the king would not be dissuaded by the fear of retribution amongst those he would speak of. Fireside talk was that those who spoke up against the Whigs and their plot could easily next day be only a memory in the mind of their family and those once around them. A person can melt away as fast as ice in the springtime, or a shadow brought into sunlight, leaving no trace. Else they could be found beaten in an alley. Willoughby's next words worried me. He spoke too much. Well, sir, what you do not know about me is that I was in confinement in one of your finest cells for a spell most recently. I sensed Willoughby glance quickly at me, most likely to check I was not discomposed at such disclosure. The king only nodded as if he already knew this, giving nothing away. While I enjoyed the hospitality of your Majesty, he paused again, but to smile tentatively, I had the dubious pleasure of spending time with a man that knew the Reverend Titus Oates abroad. What has this got to do with any new plot? He said. This one I know of. This is the point I am aiming towards, sir, and I will reach it shortly if you allow me patience. This man I shared bed with, a man named Stroud. He told me how Mr. Oates met a friend of his abroad and employed him to speak out against those that were lately executed for the murder of Sir Godfrey. If this man had information to share of the murder, it was only right he should speak out about it, said the king in a most strong voice. Yes, sir, I would not think to question that. The purpose of my words is not to question what is right, but to inform you of what I know. Willoughby managed to look uncharacteristically diffident. It was a look that did not sit well on him, with my knowledge of him. Pray continue, said the king in a voice that said he was well acquainted with reservations caused by his presence. I willed Willoughby to continue, and he did, with no show of the self-consciousness of moments before, a sign he should be on the stage. He was so accomplished at changing character at whim. The point of all of it is that in his possession, this man Stroud keeps a letter from his friends, whose name is Bedloe, saying he did not know of any plot against you, the king, more than he had been told by Reverend Oates. He revealed to me this man had perjured himself for a palm full of gold. Does he say who filled his pockets? This he does, your majesty. Pray have patience with my dull story. I am not practised at telling tales. Willoughby bowed his head low, but I could see his face, and it was not at all submissive. Pray continue, repeated the king, obviously frustrated at not knowing all at once. It occurred to me that there was purpose to Willoughby's pauses. Each time he did so, the king believed the story more. The doubt he showed when Willoughby began to speak was replaced by impatience for details of the plot. Willoughby held the king's reins and steered him, a skilled coachman, taking him whither he wished to go rather than instructed on the destination. On account of Stroud's story, I have taken it upon myself to discover the truth of the matter. I would not be presumptuous to reveal the story to you before I had acquainted myself with some of those that he talked of, to be sure of the truth of it. Willoughby took all the credit on himself, as if I had no involvement. What I have discovered will shock your majesty. I show great patience, Captain, the king sighed with exasperation. Pray come to the point. Sir, the vilest plotting is discussed openly and most keenly where you think you are safe. More horrid and noxious scheming and designing takes place in the heart of your own government by those you trust most. Again Willoughby made a point of looking at each of the men standing in the room as if they might be the ears of the enemy. Again I imagined he might have acted on the stage at some time, so dramatic was his stance. Though abhorrent to me, I have spent time in the company of those who are a danger to you and written down their speeches so you may judge them for yourself. What? Is this not the most loyal and devoted subject? He spoke to the two men I did not know, who stood behind him, and swept his hand wide towards Willoughby, as though he filled the whole room. Have you this paper here with you? This was the moment we waited for. When he saw proof of the plot, he might be satisfied and take action to protect himself. He would also see what they called the Popish plot against him was woven to hide other Presbyterian deeds. The table would soon be turned. From beneath his cloak, Willoughby took his bound sheaf of papers, now secured by a length of my red ribbon, and held it in front of him as an offering. Bring your papers to me, Captain. Head bent, Willoughby approached with suitable humble demeanour, but then took his feathered hat from his periwigged curls and swept it as widely as the king had moments before swept his hand, bowing deeply as he did so, before looked with great daring straight into the king's eyes as he passed him the papers. Your Majesty is most kind. I am honoured to share my simple but modest scribblings, and hope you might find gratitude for this sincere and heartfelt means to serve my king. Willoughby understood that sincerity is rarely believed without seeing into a man's soul, and risked himself to prove himself true. It was hard not to admire his practised audacity and skill, and at that moment I could easily believe how he had talked himself in and out of so many escapades as he had described to me in such a short life. The king untied the ribbon and lay it on his lap. Then he read the pages before him, asking questions to clarify who said what at a particular time when it was not recorded in writing. He also asked questions about the dates when these conversations occurred. Willoughby answered smoothly. It would be hard for the king not to be convinced. All the details were given with confidence. At the end, the king dropped the hand holding the papers into his lap and looked first at Willoughby, then at me. Will you swear all you say of this before the bench? I will. You have done me the profoundest service bringing me this news. It does indeed deserve gratitude, and gratitude you shall have." Willoughby again bowed low, widely sweeping the hat in his hand in front of him. "All I have done in this affair I have taken upon myself as a humble and devoted subject of your kingdom. I live only to serve your Majesty." In his speech he again neglected me, and how I had employed him in this business, and took credit for it all upon himself. "Then you must have payment for your trouble, and for your goodness in bringing this news to me." The king called for his purse, and when it arrived, opened it, and took out some gold coins. He called Willoughby forward. The captain did as he was bid, and elegantly knelt before his Majesty. "Take this, and keep your ear to the ground. If you discover any further facts for me, bring them at once." With his eyes lowered, Willoughby accepted a handful of coins, perhaps as much as the Duke of York had given him, then stood and backed until he reached a few steps away. He then knelt again for effect, and thanked the king for his graciousness. "Nay, it is your kindness that I thank you for. You have brought my attention where it was neglected, and for this I am pleased. You may take your leave now." Thinking the king had forgotten me, I started backing towards the door, as did Willoughby. "Mrs. Cellier!" As if a whip cracked over me, my head shot up, and I looked King Charles in his face, forgetting myself. Should I have curtsied lower? Should I have said something I did not? "Your Majesty." I curtsied to my knee and stayed there. "Mrs. Cellier, I have my purse open, and it is incumbent on me to repay some interest on the debt long overdue you, though my brother has repaid the capital." I said nothing. It was not my place to presume to deny the king his generosity, so I waited. "Will you come forward, Mrs. Cellier, and take a small token in lieu of full payment?" I pushed myself to my feet, my legs not as steady as I would have liked them to be, and stepped slowly to the throne. The king held out a bulging fist, and I was obliged to hold my hand beneath it. Without intention, I looked up into our king's face, the second King Charles, and almost jumped when he closed one eye in a saucy wink, the other eye glinting with humour. The number of years under his hat may be equal to mine, but where the cloak of loose and scandalous life folk would have me wear was imaginary. He wore his so brazenly and boldly none would question it. He audaciously kept his bastards and their mothers in his court, so none would whisper about the issue of his carnal pleasures. I did not know what to do. Likely others in the room too saw his wink, so I could not feign blindness. It would be gravely uncivil and ungracious to ignore royalty, but neither could I wink back, complicit in his act. It would not be seemly, nor in my heart. "Why, I am grateful your highness remembers my service to the Duchess of York. May her soul rest in peace. I am furthermore happy my service to this present matter might safely deliver the king from such a dreadful plot, and that your Majesty finds himself in such fine spirits once more." I accompanied this speech in the manner of Willoughby by fast circling my hand in the fashion of an elaborate flourish and curtsying deep, finishing on my knee with a bow down so low to the floor. But I could not resist a quick peep to see how the king would respond, and when I saw he smiled, and those behind him were not looking, I winked so only he could see. At first he snorted with astonishment as I caught him unaware, and then he released a belly laugh that filled every corner of the chamber, that made the men not paying attention behind him jump. Though unaware of the source of amusement, as a flock of sheep, other men in the room baaed delicately, for it might be seen as surly not to join in. "Mrs. Cellier, your actions are most refreshing. Your services are gratefully received." With laughter still commanding his face, King Charles clapped his hand at shoulder height. "Colonel Halshall," he addressed the man who came forward. It was His Majesty's cupbearer. "Be so good as to take Mrs. Cellier and Captain Willoughby to the Honourable Mr. Coventry, and ask him to listen to their tale. He will especially enjoy this one, since it involves his old friend Lord Shaftesbury." The king wiped the corner of his eye with the back of his fingers. and wiped them on his regal clothes. Then, addressing Willoughby and myself, he dismissed us with the words, "Mr. Secretary Coventry will see to your needs." As we backed out of the court, I remembered the words of Lord Paris when supping at the Tower one time, when he laughed at how this Mr. Coventry had defended a man of the government, Mr. Samuel Pepys, and that was now also falsely accused and in the Tower, by saying, There are a great many more Catholics than think themselves so, if having a crucifix will make one." He was spoken highly of by all the lords, and if he was so admired by them, then he would have my trust also.